that I learned in this book about Nick was insane. What I remember from like the media headlines, documentaries, and things like that was that, you allegedly manipulated someone who possibly was, disabled in some ways. And that was not confirmed or, anything in the book, but I think that is some of what the public thinks. But
Right.
based on what I read in this book was that he was already having all types of very, very violent fantasies prior to even meeting you.
Correct. He had those with other ex-girlfriends
Who reached out to you?
who reached out to me to warn me that he was like that. And I'm like, oh, it's just, it's a scorned ex-girlfriend. And I just kind of like brushed it off like, oh,
Right.
whatever. Like, they're just talking smack.
And you just ignored it.
I just ignored it.
I am back with another deep dive into the complex and at times baffling story of Gypsy Rose Blanchett. Today we are peeling back the layers of an interview Gypsy gave where she shared insights about her life, her relationship, and the infamous events that led to her mother's death. As always, we are not here to sugarcoat or sensationalize, but to critically analyze her words and the choices she's made, keeping our focus on the details she provides and how they shape the narrative she wants to tell. So grab a seat, settle in, and let's explore Gypsy's story in her own words and why her portrayal of events doesn't always add up. Let's start with the book. Gypsy said she's been working on this project for 3 years, with editing completed after her release from prison.
Oh, it's not exactly right now. I've been working on it for about 3 years.
Okay.
The portion that was the final pieces was editing, and that came after I got released.
Okay. So it's been a work in progress for a long time.
It has.
She describes the process as cathartic but challenging, requiring her to gather information from family and friends to fill in the gaps in her memory. This suggests she wants the book to be a definitive account of her experiences. However, there's a question worth asking. How reliable can a narrative be when it's pieced together from fragments and filtered through years of trauma and self-reflection? Gypsy's claim that writing the book was a healing process makes sense on the surface, but let's consider another angle. The timing of its release, shortly after her prison sentence and during a time when public curiosity remains high, could also hint at a strategic move. Was it a way to cement her version of events while ensuring maximum visibility? While she frames it as a tool to help others, there is an undeniable undertone of self-preservation at play. In her interview, Gypsy discussed how certain details in the book, such as reaching out to her family members to confirm timelines or events, were new even to her.
It was challenging at times because I had to kind of ask for information from family members because I know my side of things, but I don't know the full picture. So I had
Sure.
to talk to family, I had to talk to, friends, to get a lot of information that I didn't know about.
Right. So
While this collaborative effort is understandable given her years of isolation and abuse, it's also worth questioning how much of this information is truly accurate. By her own admission, she's relying on second-hand accounts for key parts of her story, which makes the narrative inherently subjective. And then there's the language she uses to describe her experiences. She mentions using a striking metaphor in the book, "My throat was going to be cut," to convey the urgency and desperation she felt during her abuse. While powerful, it's worth questioning whether these literally devices enhance understanding or manipulate emotions to serve her narrative. Gypsy admits this metaphor was crafted with her co-authors, raising the question of how much of the book reflects her true voice versus the polished story of her collaborators.
Let me eat, or the majority of my nutrition came from my feeding tube
right.
and formula based nutrition.
All the way up until you were how old?
24. I was about, up
Oh,
until
wow.
the prime itself.
I did not realize that. So when you don't have those glands anymore, what does that do for eating food?
So the salivary glands isn't exactly part of why I had the feeding tube.
Okay.
So the salivary glands was taken out after the feeding tube was
Okay.
already placed in. But what your salivary glands do is produce saliva. So if often you'll see me drink, lick my lips, that is often a sign that my mouth is really dry, because without the 2 salivary glands in my neck, I produce less saliva.
Moreover, when asked about her family's reaction to the book, Gypsy admitted she doesn't know how certain members, like Claude, feel about it, emphasizing her limited interaction with them over the years. This creates an additional layer of ambiguity, as many family perspectives that could either validate or challenge her claims remain unheard. While the book positions itself as a comprehensive look at her life, this absence of internal viewpoints weakens its reliability as a definitive account. Gypsy paints a complex picture of her relationship with her mother, Didi Blanchard. On one hand, she acknowledges the severe abuse she endured, including medical procedures she didn't need, a feeding tube until she was 24, and being forced to use a wheelchair despite being able to walk. In her interview, she detailed how this environment was isolating and described Didi as someone who kept in the bubble, actively avoiding contact with extended family and friends.
So CPS comes just one time in your entire life?
Entire life.
I don't even have words because I've seen CPS get involved in situations for much, much less and either do something or don't. And so when you look back, I mean, at the time, did it even cross your mind to tell CPS what was going on?
I didn't even know who they were. So I want to make it clear that when I grew up, like, okay, so most parents, to kind of discipline their children, they're like, oh, the boogeyman's going to get you.
Right.
Okay. So my mom never said the boogeyman. My mom said the state. So I grew up being afraid of people that I thought were bad people
Right.
that were going to take me away from her. And they were called the state. And so what I didn't know back then was she was telling me to be afraid of CPS. And I didn't know that then. It wasn't until after I got out of prison that I kind of figured it all out.
Right.
And so when they came, I didn't know who they were. I'm like, do they work with the police? And they're asking me questions like, do I have bruises on my arms and legs?
Right. And did you?
I didn't. I didn't at that point in time. I didn't.
Gypsy also revealed that Didi often controlled every aspect of their lives, from their diet to their movements, even dragging herself with a Mabian at night to maintain control during the day. On the other hand, Gypsy now reflects on Didi's humanity, suggesting that isolation and untreated mental health issues may have contributed to her behavior. This softer perspective is evident in her acknowledgement that Didi's actions, while harmful, might have stemmed from her own insecurities and struggles. Gypsy admitted she has mixed feelings about her mother, describing her as both a caregiver and a figure who forced her into roles she wasn't prepared for, including being her emotional confidant.
And it's really shocking to me because even in certain medical records, there is descriptions of certain illnesses. So my mother described me as paralyzed from the waist down. But in certain transcripts, there is quadriplegic, paraplegic. So it is, I'm like, there's a difference in the two. So if you're a doctor, my eyes would be looking at that and automatically want to correct what's wrong. So it's like the medical records are basically scattered to the wind in inaccuracy. And it's so hard to piece together any sort of sense.
Well, she's going doctor to doctor.
Doctor to doctor.
Maybe some of the files are not going with her, right?
Correct. She did not transfer them to one hospital to another.
Right.
So when the new doctor would ask for old records, she would claim that they were all, washed away in Hurricane Katrina because back in 2005, there was still that transfer from hard copy records to computer digital.
Even now.
This more forgiving perspective is a stark contrast to the way Gypsy's actions immediately after her mother's death were portrayed. Removing photos from the wall to obscure her identity and fleeing with her then boyfriend Nico de Jong show a calculated attempt to erase her past, not the actions of someone grappling with compassion or regret. Gypsy described this period as being in complete survival mode. Yet the effort she put into planning and covering her tracks suggest a more deliberate approach. While it's natural for Gypsy's feelings toward Didi to evolve over time, this newfound empathy can feel like an attempt to rewrite her role in the story as more reflective and less complicit. Another area worth examining is Gypsy's claim that Didi manipulated everyone around her. While this is undoubtedly true to a large extent, as evidenced by Didi's ability to deceive medical professionals, family members, and even authorities, Gypsy's own agency in perpetuating some of these lies shouldn't be overlooked. She admitted in the interview that while she always knew she could walk, she complied with her mother's insistence on using a wheelchair because of fear of dependency.
And it's really shocking to me because even in certain medical records, there is descriptions of certain illnesses. So my mother described me as paralyzed from the waist down, but in certain transcripts there is quadriplegic,
Mhm.
paraplegic. So it is. I'm like, there's a difference in the two. So if you're a doctor, my eyes would be looking at that and automatically want to correct what's wrong. So it's like the medical records are basically scattered to the wind in inaccuracy, and it's so hard to piece together any sort of sense.
Well, she's going doctor to doctor.
Doctor to doctor.
Maybe some of the files are not going with her, right?
Correct. She did not transfer
Mm-hmm.
them to one hospital to another.
Right.
So when the new doctor would ask for old records, she would claim that they were all, washed away in Hurricane Katrina, because back in 2005, there was still that transfer from hard copy
Yep.
records to computer.
Even
digital.
now.
Gypsy explained that she was trapped in a mental prison, a state of mind cultivated by years of manipulation and isolation. While this explanation partially valid, it's also a convenient excuse that absolves her of accountability for her role in maintaining the facade for as long as she did. For instance, she discussed moments when she would dance alone or stretch her legs while Didi was asleep.
When she would go to sleep, I know that in parts of the book you talked about still being in your wheelchair, but were there ever times that you did get out of your wheelchair and walk while she was asleep?
There would be times. So, like, if she had to go run an errand, there was times as I got older
Right.
that I did want to stretch my legs and get out of the wheelchair. And so, some of the most freeing times that I had was I would play CDs on the boombox and just dance.
Yeah.
That was my freedom.
Did she
But it
know
was-
that you were doing that?
She didn't. She did not, because I would be in trouble for walking even inside the house.
Oh, wow. So then did you lose muscle mass in your legs because you were in the wheelchair so much, or no?
I didn't lose muscle mass.
No.
No, because I still, like, every once in a while I would move my legs here and there, not meaning to, but she would have to correct me and be like, "Stop moving your legs."
At what point did you realize that you were not actually needing the wheelchair? Like, how old do you think you were?
I mean, I always knew that I could walk, and I've always been honest about that, but it was. And this goes right into the title. This is why I wanted to have the word "stand" in the title, is because, yes, I knew that I could walk. However, my mom didn't let me get out of the chair.
But she made no effort to reveal the truth when CPS visited or questioned her. The contradiction highlights the blurred line between victimhood and complicity in Gypsy's narrative. Gypsy's attempts to escape her mother's control are pivotal moments in her story. The first, involving a man named Dan, is particularly revealing. Gypsy portrayed this as a naive, desperate bid for freedom, but the details paint a different picture. She lied about her age, manipulated Dan into thinking she was younger, and fled to his home without disclosing the full extent of her situation. When Didi found her, Gypsy agreed to return home in exchange for the promise of continued contact with Dan, a promise Didi predictably broke.
And Dan was an adult that you met at a convention.
Correct.
And you guys had a romantic interest in each other?
I mean, I had a crush on him.
Right.
And I think he thought that I was cute, but it wasn't to the point where it was a relationship.
Okay. But you guys maybe had a little bit of an interest,
I
a
was
fling.
I was like, he's cute.
How old is he? How old was he?
He was 36.
And he thought you were how old?
15 at the time.
So that would be a pedophile, right?
I don't like saying that word. I don't
That
like
would be,
labeling someone anything. I don't
okay.
like labels put on me, so that's why I don't put labels on
Okay.
other people.
Fair.
That's what I'm
Okay.
saying.
But it's questionable. It's definitely questionable behavior.
This incident raises an important question. Was Gypsy truly powerless, or was she playing a long game to escape on her own terms? Her actions during this and subsequent escape attempts suggest a level of cunning that contrasts with the helpless image she often projects. And then there's Nick Godejohn. Gypsy's relationship with Nick is arguably the most scrutinized aspect of her story. She met him on a Christian dating site, framing this as an attempt to find a good guy. But her interactions with Nick quickly took a dark turn. Gypsy downplays her role in their plans, emphasizing Nick's valiant fantasies on her own reluctance.
That I learned in this book about Nick was insane. What I remember from like the media headlines, documentaries, and things like that was that, you allegedly manipulated someone who possibly was, disabled in some ways. And that was not confirmed or, anything in the book, but I think that is some of what the public thinks. But
Right.
based on what I read in this book was that he was already having all types of very, very violent fantasies prior to even meeting you.
Correct. He had those with other ex-girlfriends
Who reached out to you?
who reached out to me to warn me that he was like that. And I'm like, oh, it's just, it's a scorned ex-girlfriend. And I just kind of like brushed it off, like, oh,
Right.
whatever. Like, they're just talking smack.
And you just ignored it.
I just ignored it.
However, court records and Facebook messages tell a more complex story. Gypsy was an active participant in discussing ways to kill Didi, even proposing methods herself. Her attempt to portray herself as merely manipulated by Nick is unconvincing. The evidence suggests a relationship built on mutual toxicity, where both parties fueled each other's worst impulses. Gypsy's admission that she romanticized the idea of being her man's savior adds another layer of complexity but doesn't excuse her involvement.
The things that some of the ideas that he brought to you
Mhm.
about how to unalive your mom were twisted.
And all of that is factual evidence, and it's in Facebook messages. There is actual proof that these things were said. Whether or not those case files are released to the public, I'm not sure, but there is a paper trail.
So did that come up in court, like in trial?
It did. It was discussed.
So people could find that if they wanted to. I'm sure.
The prosecutor definitely did.
This was the first time I had read that, so I don't know if there's a little bit of attention on it, in the media, but
Gypsy's description of the night of the crime is another area where her narrative invites scrutiny. She claims she was in survival mode, making decisions based purely on fear and desperation. However, her own recounting of events complicates this narrative. She admits to packing a bag with items, including her baby bottle, which she had continued to use for comfort even as an adult. She also methodically removed photos of herself from the walls, an action she said was meant to confuse authorities about her identity. These steps suggest not just fear but also deliberate premeditation. Gypsy's admission that she stayed in her wheelchair during the incident, despite being fully capable of walking, adds another layer of complexity. She stated in the interview that this wasn't a calculated choice but rather a conditioned response after years of being forced to play the role of someone with severe disability. Yet, it's hard to overlook how this decision could also serve to maintain the appearance of helplessness, even in the midst of such a pivotal moment. Additionally, Gypsy spoke about the surreal mindset she was in that night. She described being so overwhelmed that she didn't fully grasp the weight of her action, going so far as to say she believed removing the photos might erase her presence from the home altogether. This level of dissociation highlights how deeply entrenched she was in a world where survival and deception were intertwined. However, survival mode doesn't fully explain her behavior. Gypsy was clearly aware of the implications of her actions, evidenced by her decision to leave the home and flee with Nick rather than seek help or report her mother's abuse through other channels. Her initial lack of remorse also stands out. In her interview, Gypsy avoided discussing the emotional aftermath of the crime in detail, focusing instead on the sense of relief she felt at finally being free. This raises important questions about how much of her decision was driven by desperation and how much by a desire to erase her past without facing emotional and legal consequences. While her circumstances were undeniably there, her choices reflect a level of agency that complicates the narrative of pure victimhood. In prison, Gypsy claims she focused on self-improvement and earning her GED and avoiding attention. However, accounts from fellow inmates and her interactions with high-profile prisoners like Pamela Happ suggest a more complicated dynamic. While Gypsy may have avoided over-fame seeking, she was certainly aware of her notoriety and its potential benefits. Her plans for the future, pursuing cosmetology, building a family with Ken, and raising awareness about abuse, are admirable, but they also serve to distance herself from the darker aspects of her past. Gypsy's narrative now emphasizes growth and redemption, but it's important to question how much of this is genuine and how much of this is carefully crafted to fit a post-incarceration image. Gypsy Rose Blanchard's story is undeniably complex, filled with moments of both vulnerability and calculated decision making. While she has faced immense hardship, it's crucial to approach her narrative with a critical eye. Her portrayal of events often minimizes her agency while emphasizing her victimhood, creating a version of the story that is both compelling and carefully constructed. Gypsy's story isn't just about escaping her mother's control. It's also about how she navigates the consequences of her actions and shapes the narrative of her life moving forward. Thank you for joining me in this deep dive. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear what you think about Gypsy's story and how she tells it. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning.